It's a great honor to be here and to have received this award. And as you heard, this will be a talk in 3 parts. I only realize now that the speakers can't really see any of you because of the light. So if I'm not making eye contact, it's not because it's late onset autism, it's simply that I don't really know where I'm looking. So this is the outline of what I'm going to cover in the next few minutes. The role of experience in brain development, critical periods, what we mean by critical periods, the effects of profound deprivation on development, and then I'm going to introduce this project that we mentioned just a moment ago that my 2 colleagues will then come up and share the findings. So let me start with some basic background to how the brain develops. We know that individuality is the product of both biological inheritance and personal experiences, that our genes specify the properties of neurons and neural connections to different degrees, in different pathways, and at different levels of processing. But because many aspects of the individual's world are not predictable, the circuitry of the brain relies on experience to customize these connections to serve the needs of the individual, which explains why no 2 brains are alike.
Are people hearing him okay? You can hear? Okay,
yeah.
Good.
So experience shapes these neural connections and interactions, but always within the constraints imposed by genetics. So, some experiences are, or at least should be, universal to all members of the species. So an example would be sensory input. When a baby is born, they have patterned light, they hear sound. But others may optimize development. So for example, it's one thing to have a caregiver who feeds you, but it's another to have a caregiver who invests in you, who is sensitive and responsive to your needs. Similarly, it's one thing to have ambient sounds in the background. It's another to have age-appropriate language spoken to you. In many cases, both classes of experience have to occur during a narrow window of time, which we refer to as a critical period or a sensitive period, for development to proceed along a typical developmental trajectory. And here's a model of what this would look like. I borrowed this from my colleague, Tikao Hensch. So what we're seeing here is that genes begin to specify the different properties of the brain, and then experience during different points in time exerts a powerful effect. And this is designed to illustrate when the brain is most receptive to these experiences. Now, I'm modeling this postnatally, but of course we can all think of examples of experience prenatally that affects the developing brain. Substance use would be just one example of that. And you'll also see that different domains have different critical periods. Sensory tends to be earlier than motor and language, which tends to be earlier than higher cognition. And we've heard a lot about this from at least 2 of our speakers today in adolescent development, when the prefrontal cortex is really starting to come online. I should also add that even within domains, there are cascading critical periods. So it's not as though within a domain there's a critical period, there may be multiple critical periods. So 2 final points about experience. One is that experience cuts both ways. If a child is exposed to adverse experiences during a critical period, such as infection or maltreatment, or deprived of expectable experiences, then brain development can be undermined. Brain plasticity also changes with age. In some domains, change is possible throughout the lifespan. Learning and memory is the classic example of that. But in others, change is not easily accomplished. We don't learn to see better, for example. So some systems are set up very early in life and difficult to change later. Others are malleable throughout life. So in my talk today, I'm going to focus on what happens to the brain when there's a profound violation of the expectable environment. Specifically, what happens when children fail to receive the stimulation necessary to foster healthy brain development. So let's talk about psychosocial deprivation. We know that neglect is the most common form of child maltreatment, that a particularly extreme form of neglect is being raised in conditions of profound psychosocial deprivation, such as infants raised in institutions. Currently, there are about 8 million children around the world who are being raised in institutions. There are more than 140 million parentless children around the world, and a more recent phenomenon is the 61 million left behind children in China. These are children who've been left by their parents while their parents go find work. So this is a substantial problem. And as disease and illness and war continues to ravage the planet, the number of parentless children probably will just increase. So in roughly 1999 or 2000, my two colleagues and I, Charles Zeanah and Nathan Fox, launched the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. And the focus was to examine the effects of institutionalization on brain and behavioral development of young children, to determine if these effects can be remediated through an intervention, in our case, foster care, and then to improve the welfare of children in Romania and later throughout the world by establishing foster care as an alternative to institutionalization. So some background. This is Nicolae Ceausescu. He assumed control of Romania in 1966. He had an idea that he could increase his power if he increased the population. So the way he did that was he first established the menstrual police. These were state gynecologists who conducted monthly checks of women of all childbearing age in the workplace. He established a celibacy tax. So basically any family that had fewer than 5 kids was heavily taxed, and then he outlawed all contraception and abortion. And a result of this was the birth rate skyrocketed, and child abandonment became a national disaster. Families could not afford to keep their kids, and Ceausescu conveniently built a system of institutions throughout the country to warehouse these children. And in 1989, when the Ceausescu regime ended, there were more than 170,000 children growing up in state-run institutions. Poverty was often given as the #1 treatment for child abandonment, but of course we all know there are poor people throughout the world who don't abandon their kids. So this was also a cultural phenomenon. And on Ceausescu's part, it was also an experiment in social engineering. In January of 1990, the Western media flooded into the country, discovered many of these children languishing in state-run institutions, and this is what we found 10 years later. So infants lying in cribs, often 10 to 15 to a room, staring at white ceilings. This is a room of toddlers, and what you'll start to see in a few moments is children engaging in stereotypies like this. So altogether, if I let this completely play out, there might be 15 to 20 kids in this room, and very soon, most of them will be rocking like this. So what is bad about institutional care? It's regimented daily schedule, it's non-individualized, sensory, social, emotional, cognitive, and linguistic deprivation, no response to distress, unchecked aggression, a lack of psychological investment by caregivers, and a high ratio of kids to caregivers. Finally, there are rotating shifts of caregivers. So in any given ward, there might be 7 to 15 children with one caregiver, and those caregivers rotate throughout the day. We've known for many years that children reared in institutions are at a high risk for developing a variety of cognitive, social, and behavioral problems, relationships and attachment, externalizing behavior problems and attention hyperactivity, deficits in IQ and executive functions, a syndrome that mimics autism, and growth stunting. So here's an example of growth stunting. So I want you to think, are these boys or girls and how old they are? And so this is a 17-year-old girl, and this is a 14-year-old girl. So children generally lose about a month of linear growth for about every month they spend in a bad institution. And this is not nutritional deprivation generally, it's psychosocial deprivation that drives this. So we designed this randomized controlled trial of foster care as an intervention for early institutionalization. Our colleague Dana Johnson screened more than 180 young babies and little children to make sure none had frank neurological or genetic disorders or problems. And of those, we landed on 136 infants between 6 and 31 months who passed our screen and seemed to be typically developing. And we did an extensive baseline assessment on all of them, at which point we then randomly assigned half to a foster care intervention that we built and maintained and financed, and the other half were randomly assigned to remain in institutional care. And then we recruited a sample of 72 children who had never been in an institution, lived with their families in the city. We saw these children at 9, 18, 30, and 42 months, again at 54 months, again at age 8, again at age 12, and we'll complete our 16-year follow-up in a few months. The three of us come from different backgrounds. None of us are terribly flexible, and so when we would discuss what we should study, this eventually became the list. because we really couldn't agree on what was the most important thing. So now we pretty much study everything. These are some of the ethical considerations in this study, and I just want to briefly touch on a few of them before I turn things over to my colleagues. Of course, we have informed consent from all US universities and Romania that we could do randomization in part because previous studies were subject to sample bias. So if you think of studies that have focused on internationally adopted children, children who have adopted out of institutions, we don't know who gets to be adopted and who does not. In addition, there was a policy debate within Romania. They viewed institutionalization as the intervention for abandonment, but there was a debate within the country whether that was the best alternative. And of course, if the study had never been done, all the children would still be living in institutions, and the government would not have moved its position away from institutional care. There was no more than minimal risk in participation. In a clinical trial like this, there's often a stop rule, so if we find the efficacy of the intervention, we might stop the study. If we stop the study, all the kids would go back to the institution. So we engaged in a bit of shaming with the US ambassador. We called a press conference and announced our preliminary findings to the country and to the press, at which point, a year later, the government passed legislation forbidding the institutionalization of any child under 2 and started government foster care. We had a policy of non-interference, so children were free to change their group assignment if they had been randomly assigned to the care as usual group or institutional group. If they had the opportunity to change that, for example, the authorities might decide to reunite them with their biological family or place them in government foster care. That all happened. The data you'll be hearing about from my colleagues are based on what we call an intent to treat design, meaning that the data are analyzed based on the original group assignment, not the current living conditions. So by the time children were 8 or 12 or 16, the vast majority of kids in the institutional group were no longer living in an institution, but we still preserve that by analyzing the data based on where they were assigned. The intervention was high-quality foster care. Charlie and his colleagues at Tulane developed this. Families received a monthly stipend that was equivalent to the average per capita income in Romania at the time. Very close monitoring. Social workers visited the families roughly every 10 days. They met with us via Skype or in person every 7 days or so. Social workers and the psychologists were chiefly involved in monitoring all this. We provided all material support. We had a 24-hour on-call pediatrician. Romania law required that one parent stay at home with the child. And all families were licensed. So this was very high-quality foster care. We did not cut corners in this. So we're now nearing completion of our 16-year follow-up, and my 2 colleagues are going to summarize our findings to date. And I think we've decided that we'll hold questions until everyone has spoken. Is that right?
The 3 presentations.
Yes. Okay. So, thank you.
I'm Nathan Fox, and I'm going to be presenting to you some of the results from the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. Basically, I'm going to be asking and answering 3 questions about the domains of attachment, IQ, brain function, and stress responsivity. And those 3 questions are, first, when we assessed all of the infants and young children while they were all living in the institution, what are the effects of that early experience on each of these domains? The second question I'm going to ask is, we did a randomized controlled trial within foster care intervention. And so the second question is, at each of the assessment points where we examined the children, was there, in fact, an intervention effect? And the third question, which goes to what Chuck has already told you about in terms of critical or sensitive periods, is, was there a point in time that the intervention had the greatest impact in terms of remediating each of these domains? That would give us some evidence of there being a sensitive period in development. So let me first start with attachment. I'm starting with attachment really because Bowlby was one of the first to bring attention to the plight of infants and children who were living in institutional care. He was commissioned by the World Health Organization in the early 50s to review the status of infants and children who were living in institutional care. And because of that report, in part, institutions were closed in the UK and in the United States. So we examined the relationship between the infants who were living in the institutions and their caregivers. And we used a measure called the Ainsworth and Witt exchange situation. So what we found is that in order for us to code the videos for these children, what we needed to do is we needed to have a continuum of attachment. And the traditional way in which attachment is coded, it gives a classification of A, B, C, and D, and you can see that that's a number 5. And the other 4 patterns, 1 through 4, are reflecting anomalous behaviors that the infants and young children were exhibiting during this particular procedure. When we look at the data, this is now at baseline prior to randomization, what we find is that in the community sample, 100% of the children there are showing a typical pattern of attachment behavior in this particular paradigm. But only 3% of the infants and young children who are living in the institution are showing this particular pattern. The rest are showing anomalous patterns of behavior. So I answered my first question, which is that living in an institution, having this early experience of psychosocial deprivation is associated with aberrant patterns of attachment in infants and young children. Now I'm going to answer my second question, or present the data for the second question, which is, what about the intervention? Is there, in fact, an intervention effect? And the answer is that when we looked at the children at 42 months of age, we find that the children in the foster care are showing an intervention effect. It's not a complete intervention. They don't look like the children in the community, but there is an intervention effect relative to the children who were randomized to remain in the institution. So there is an intervention effect, answering my second question. Third question, though, is there a timing effect? Is there a sensitive period during which the intervention had its greatest impact? And the answer here is yes, there is. I've broken down the ages of placement into foster care for just the foster care sample. And what you can see there is that there's a cut point, a break point at around 24 months of age. Those infants that were taken out of the institution and placed into the families that we identified into the foster care group, they showed a secure attachment pattern at 42 months. Those children who were placed after 24 months of age were less likely to show a secure pattern of attachment. So to summarize those findings, there are large differences in baseline between, in terms of security of attachment. There is an intervention effect, but it's not complete. But timing is important. There seems to be a sensitive period here in which more children are secure if they're placed between 22 and 24 months of age. The next domain that I'll quickly overview is IQ. We were interested in, obviously, in the cognitive abilities of the children who are living in the institutions. So at baseline, we use the Bayley scales of mental development. The Bayley scales are meaned at 100 with a standard deviation of 15. And here's what we found. The green bar is the community control sample, and you can see they have a mean of around 100. But the children who are living in the institution, they have a mean of around 64, which shows significant delay, a significant cognitive delay amongst that sample. So obviously, living in an institution for those children has a detrimental effect upon their cognitive abilities. To answer my second question, we looked to see whether there was an intervention effect. And indeed, through the first 54 months of age, you can see here that there is. At each of those assessment points, the red bars are the children who were randomized to the foster care. The yellow bars, children who remained in the institution. You can see that children who were randomized and placed into foster care had significantly higher IQ scores compared to those children who were randomized to remain in the institution. And to answer my third question with respect to these data, we looked to see whether there was a timing effect. And again, you can see a very similar pattern to the pattern that you saw with attachment. There's a cut point at around 24 months of age with those children who were taken out of the institution and placed into families before 24 months of age having normal IQ scores, and those children who were taken out and placed into families after 24 months of age having significantly lower IQ scores. Now, we followed up the children, as Chuck mentioned to you, and I just want to show you what the data look like at age 12. And it's remarkable that what we're finding here is that we continue to find an intervention effect. We don't find a timing effect anymore, but we do find an intervention effect with the children who are randomized to foster care showing a significantly higher IQ scores, full-scale IQ, compared to those children who were randomized to remain in the institution. And this summary just tells you that young children living in institutions show significant delays in IQ. Removing them, particularly before 24 months, seems to remediate that. What I didn't tell you, but what is equally important, is that stability of placement, that is remaining in the family in which we place the child, has a significant import for these IQ scores. And remarkably, 10 years after the intervention began, there's still a significant effect of the intervention on the IQ scores of these children. Okay, my third domain is in brain function. One of the unique things about the Bucharest Early Intervention Project is that we built a laboratory in one of the institutions, and we set it up to do electrophysiology. And as I'll tell you in just a moment, we also did structural imaging of the sample. And so to answer my first question, what was the electrophysiology like of the children who were living in the institutions? These are topographic maps, and what you can see here is that the community sample has that large area of red, which shows heightened activity in the alpha frequency band, but there's a total absence of that power and of that activity in the children who were living in the institution. It's as if you took a rheostat and turned down the electrical volume and energy in the brains of the children who were living in the institution. When we followed the children up, we found that an intervention and a timing effect to occur by age 8 in the children in the study. The bottom two topographic maps show you the community controls, never institutionalized group, and the foster care children who were taken out before 24 months of age. They're indistinguishable. And in the top two, you can see the care as usual group. Those are the children randomized to remain in the institution, and children who were taken out and placed into foster care after 24 months of age, again showing an intervention effect and a timing effect, a sensitive timing effect related to this 24-month period of time. Remarkably, when we saw these children at age 12, what we find is not a timing effect, but we do find a continued intervention effect for the EEG alpha power across the different areas of the brain. So the summary of the EEG findings is that institutionalization leads to a dramatic reduction in brain activity. Placement into foster care leads to recovery, particularly if placement occurs before 24 months of age. And intervention effects persist through age 12. There's no washout. Now, as I mentioned, we also did structural imaging of the children at both 8 and 16 years of age, and I'll briefly review those results. What we found is rather dramatic. There was a significant effect of ever being placed into an institution. There was no intervention effect in gray matter. You can see there that at both 8 years of age and now again at 16 years of age, which is our most recent data point, and these data are sort of hot off the press right now, what we find is that both the foster care children and the children randomized to remain in the institution have significantly lower gray matter compared to a community sample. That's not true about white matter volume. What you see here is that there appears to be an intervention effect at both 8 years of age, and that intervention effect remains at 16 years of age, with the foster care group sort of being in the middle, but showing an increase in white matter volume relative to children who were randomized to remain in the institution. What's also striking in the 16-year data is that some areas within the care as usual group at age 16, they have thicker cortices compared to the foster care children. That is, they did not show the appropriate thinning of frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex, compared to the children who were randomized to be placed in the foster care. And you can see in that comparison, it's particularly in this area of IFG, which is an area of prefrontal cortex that's associated with language. So the summary of the brain effects are that there's differential effects on gray and white matter. There's some evidence that there are neglect-associated alterations in cortical thinning, and the care as usual group at age 16 has this thickening of prefrontal cortex, which possibly indicates a delay in maturation. Okay. The last area that I'll be talking about is stress responsivity. We presented the children with at age 12 with a stressful task elicitor called the Trier social stress test. They had to get up, they had to give a speech in front of 2 people, and then they had a math test in which they were given a large number, 956, and they had to count backwards by 7 in a rapid way. We measured their autonomic activity, their heart rate, their blood pressure, and we got sympathetic response, and we also took saliva and got cortisol from them to look at stress responsivity. And here's what we found. The black bars are the community controls, the gray bars are the children randomized to be in the foster care group, and the white bars are the children who were randomized to remain in the institution. And what you can see there is that while there were no differences during the preparatory period, during the stress periods, the community controls are showing the typical stress response, elevated heart rate. The foster care group is also showing this typical stress response, although not as high as the community controls, but there's a blunted response in the children who are randomized to remain in the institution. And that's true for heart rate, it's true for blood pressure as well, and also true for sympathetic activity. When we looked at cortisol for the 3 groups, the solid black line are the community controls, and they're showing the typical cortisol response. It's elevated to stress, and then there's a reduction. But you can see that there's no stress response on either the foster care group or the children who are randomized to remain in the institution. But if you look at placement, what you find is that, in fact, that solid black line now, those are the children who were taken out of the institution before 24 months of age. And you can see that their pattern of cortisol reactivity is identical to the community controls. I'll just go backwards quickly. You can see that. Those are the community controls in the solid black line. And those, and here are the foster care children who were taken out before 24 months of age. So a summary is that for stress is that psychosocial deprivation leads to a blunted physiological response, particularly in the children who remained in the institution. Random assignment to high quality care seems to lead to the development of an adaptive stress response in the foster care children. And a general summary then is that early exposure to adversity has profound consequences for attachment, cognition, brain function and structure, and stress responsivity. The foster care intervention ameliorates many of these deficits, and timing of exposure, the sensitive period, has a clear effect with the earlier, the better. Thank you very much.
Very delighted to be with you, and especially delighted and honored to receive this wonderful award. My task is to talk about psychopathology, and in the last couple of minutes I'll say a bit about competence. So the first thing to say about psychopathology is that being reared in an institution elevates the rates of psychopathology quite dramatically. So here you see in the blue are the care as usual kids, the foster care kids in red, and the community kids here. So you can just see that the gray bars are significantly lower for any disorder, for emotional disorders, for behavioral disorders, and for ADHD. In terms of intervention effects, here there was an overall intervention effect on reducing disorders and symptomatology, but it was accounted for by reductions in emotional disorders, which in this case primarily means anxiety disorders, and it was accounted for by girls rather than boys. So girls with anxiety disorders had dramatic responses to the intervention and great reductions in the prevalence of that type of psychopathology. We took a look at the mechanism by which that might occur. So we have our groups here. We know that foster care reduces psychopathology and particularly emotional disorders at 54 months, which is when the trial concluded. We decided to look at an indirect path through attachment, which we assessed at 42 months. And in fact, as Nathan showed you, there's significant differences in security of attachment in the foster care group compared to the care as usual group. We also found, as many others have, that attachment predicts subsequent psychopathology. And in fact, the indirect pathway here is significant, and so there is a mediation. So in other words, the more children form secure attachments to their caregivers, the more likely they are to have reductions in psychopathology at 54 months, and they're significantly more likely to have secure attachments if they were in the foster care intervention group. Next follow-up was at age 12, and all of these psychopathology data are basically structured psychiatric interviews with caregivers about the children. Again, we find significant elevations in various types of psychopathology in children who have a history of institutional rearing, and we find a significant intervention effect, but it's limited to behavior disorders in boys, so conduct disorder, oppositional disorder in boys. At no point did we ever find any intervention effect on ADHD, and yet we have a 4-fold increase in the prevalence of ADHD associated with institutional rearing, and that's been a typical finding in the field, that children who experience early institutional rearing have very significant rates of ADHD. Those data that I have shown so far are all following intent to treat, but at age 12 we took a look at breaking intent to treat by looking at the children who had been in foster care in the trial, and those who through age 12, this is age 4.5, through age 12 had remained stably in the same foster placement with the same foster parents versus those who had been in some other placement and had their initial placement disrupted. And we're comparing them to the community kids over here and to the care as usual kids over here, who had had significantly more disruptions, by the way. And what we find is, so here you're going to see foster FCG-D, that means disrupted, and FCG-S means stable. And here what we find is there's significant reductions in emotional symptomatology for the kids who remained in the stable foster placement compared to those who experienced at least one disruption, and significant differences in behavioral symptoms. So the stability of the placement seemed to matter. We also looked not just at one disruption or more, but looked at the number of disruptions. And both for emotional problems at age 12 and behavioral problems at age 12, as rated by parents, there were significant relationships. So the more disruptions that the child had experienced in whatever group, the more likely they were to have significantly higher emotional problems and behavioral problems. So those are sort of the more common types of psychopathology that we deal with, but when you look at kids who've experienced significant deprivation, there are also some more unusual types of psychopathology, and I'll turn to those next. One is attachment disorders, which is a relatively rare type of disorder, and the first kind of attachment disorder is called reactive attachment disorder, and that describes children who have emotionally withdrawn, inhibited behavior, lack social reciprocity, are not very responsive. And what you see is that initially at baseline, these are our two randomized groups, have elevated scores compared to the community kids and signs of reactive attachment disorder. But by 30 months, which is the first age of placement, so here the kids had experienced anywhere from 6 to 24 months of placement in foster care. These are no longer different from the community kids, but significantly lower than the children who were assigned to care as usual, many more of whom were still in institutions. And that pattern continues over time so that all the way out through age 12, the kids originally placed in foster care no longer show any elevations in reactive attachment disorder, whereas there are significant differences over time here. And you see a kind of gradual decreased slope here in the care as usual kid. Turns out that's fully accounted for by children being placed in families. So you remember from what Chuck said, many of the kids in care as usual who initially were in institutions along the way got returned to their biological families or adopted by someone or placed in government-sponsored foster care. If you take those kids out, you get a completely flat line here of the kids who had persistent institutional experience. The other type of attachment disorder is called disinhibited social engagement disorder. These kids have high levels of indiscriminate sociability. The sort of lay phrase for this is never met a stranger, kids who have socially disinhibited behavior at an age at which it's expected that they will have some reticence around unfamiliar people. And what you see here, again, is a kind of intervention effect, but not nearly as powerful as you see with reactive attachment disorder. So significant elevations compared to the community kids, and at some ages, significant differences, and at other ages, not so much. That's in keeping with what we know from the literature on international adoptions, where this indiscriminate behavior is one of the more persistent problems that develops following periods of institutional rearing. Sir Michael Rudder, who many of you may know, is a very prominent child psychiatrist who did a large study looking at children adopted out of Romanian institutions. So they were had their baseline experiences were very similar to the kids that we were studying, but they were adopted into the United Kingdom, into middle-class advantaged families. And what he found was a subset of these kids who had this very unusual problem that he called quasi-autism, because at age 4, these kids were clinically indistinguishable from children with classical autism, but as he followed them over time, although their behavior remained very aberrant, they no longer looked classically autistic. So we took a look at quasi-autism and autism spectrum disorder in our sample, and what we found was that the social abnormalities of the children who had a history of institutional rearing were very similar to the social abnormalities of children with autism, whereas their language and communication and their repetitive behaviors were really quite different. So it was the social behaviors that distinguished them. And I can just go back here, sorry. We found a significant intervention effect. You can see the foster care kids, only 16% had elevation of these highly unusual aberrant social behaviors, whereas nearly half the care as usual kids did. And if you notice the community kids, none of the community kids exhibited any of these aberrant social behaviors, just to give you an idea of how really unusual they are. Another thing that we looked at that has been in the literature in association with experiences of severe early deprivation is something called callous unemotional traits. This is believed to be a precursor to psychopathy. These are children who have callous interpersonal interactions, lack guilt, lack empathy. And what we found was that there was, in fact, an intervention effect, but it was only in boys. And you can see the care as usual boys have the highest level of care as usual traits, whereas the foster care boys are roughly comparable to the girls who showed no elevation in care as usual traits. But if you look at the kids who had really high traits, this is not, this measure doesn't have norms, but there is a cut point for what's considered very high. And you can see in the care as usual group, both girls and boys show significant elevations in this very high level of callous unemotional traits. So one of the things that we had an opportunity to do, because we have a longitudinal study, is not just look at callous unemotional traits at one point, but look at what were the precursors that might be associated with that. And we looked at two that we gleaned from reviews of the literature. One is observe caregiver interactions with the children and measures of warmth from that, and the other is caregiver response to distress. And to make a long story short, in the boys, what we found was that it was response to distress by caregivers that reduced the likelihood that these boys would have elevated callous unemotional traits later, not differences in warmth. Finally, just to flip around and look not at psychopathology, but to look at competence, we said, okay, what do competent 12-year-olds look like? We said, well, they have pretty good family relations, pretty good peer relations, they're academically competent, their physical health is okay, they're not impaired by psychopathology, they're not using tobacco and alcohol, and they're not engaging in high levels of risk-taking behavior. So what we did for our sample is we basically dichotomized these into competent versus not. For the continuous measures, we looked at being within one standard deviation of the typically developing Romanian community kids. For the categorical, is just yes or no. Were they using tobacco and alcohol or not, yes or no. And so basically, we assigned a point, 0 through 7 here, to look at competence. And we look for intervention effects, and when you do this, only about 22% of the care as usual kids are classified as competence, because we define competence, by the way, as 6 out of 7 of these. If you're competent in 6 out of 7, then you're considered competent. So only 22% of the care as usual kids, whereas just over half of the foster care kids were classified as competent. Within the foster care group, this is back to the timing effects that Nathan Fox was describing for you. Nearly 3/4 of the children placed in foster care prior to 20 months of age were classified as competent, whereas of the children placed after 20 months, it was less than half. So a very significant timing effect. And I'll just say a word about timing effects in general in our study. We urge you not to memorize these ages as something that is necessarily exactly the characteristic. If you look at the vast literature on children who've experienced early deprivations, you'll find many different numbers, and the most reasonable conclusion at this point in the state of the science is that the earlier children get out of very depriving conditions and get placed into more adequate caregiving environments, the more likely they are to recover and the more full their recovery is likely to be. So just to conclude, I just wanted to make a sort of general point, and that is that orphanages were created and it really began to flourish in kind of the mid-19th century. And the reason for orphanages was to provide physical safety for children who otherwise would be out in the street or be in these poor houses with adults where they were quite vulnerable to all sorts of bad things. The problem is that there are many, many side effects of this intervention. So it's somewhat analogous for me of if you think about very preterm infants who require ventilation and oxygen to keep them alive. High levels of oxygen can be very damaging to their eyes and to their brain and to their lungs, and they can develop bronchopulmonary dysplasia and retinopathy. And so what we've tried to do is develop an intervention that doesn't have as many side effects as the side effects of institutional rearing. So in conclusion, institutional rearing increased the risk for psychopathology. Both brain structure and functioning are compromised. High-quality foster care seems to reduce the risk, but it doesn't completely eliminate it. All of our kids had experienced significant amounts of deprivation. The average age of the child at the beginning of the study was 22 months, so they'd already experienced significant amounts of deprivation before our intervention began. The quality of relationships to caregivers in foster care and the child's attachment to the caregiver seems to be a very important part of the positive effect of the intervention. And the sooner the child gets into that much better environment, the better. The quality of foster care matters a lot, and the stability of foster care matters. So on that note, I will thank you very much and ask my colleagues to join me, and we'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you for a marvelous and elegant study. One question I had was that you are well aware of the work that people like Spitz did years and years ago. Could you say a word about what did that work contribute to your work? And what are the main ways by which your work take us much further in our understanding of these relationships?
I'll start and then we'll follow. So Spitz's work certainly led to the observation that children raised, in his case it was hospitalism, it was kids in hospitals, could have disastrous outcomes due to the, you can't hear me?
Go up to the mic.
This is on too. How's that?
1, 2, 3. This one on? Well, let's just get one. If we can get one.
How's that?
This one is on?
Chuck, use the podium.
Better if you can get past it.
Yeah, okay. So, brought to our attention the hazards of kids who are deprived. Now, he came at this through a psychoanalytic perspective, and the idea was that it was maternal deprivation. Harlow then followed this up with animal models of this, and Harlow showed monkeys were deprived of that. I think that on the one hand, and I'm curious what my colleagues think, I think on the one hand, this opened our eyes to the hazards of this kind of deprivation. On the other hand, what Spitz did was just beyond the pale ethically. It was a natural history study, basically. And I think that that also brought to mind how careful we need to be in conducting studies like this.
You want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll say that there were papers opposing institutions from early in the 20th century, and many published in the 1940s around the same time as Spitz's papers were published. And I think that the reason that Spitz's work was so powerful is because of the movies that he showed. It was the visual images that really captured people. Having said that, it's perhaps surprising to think that when we looked at the literature before our study, there were exactly 9 studies that had compared children in foster care to children in institutions. And all of them found that children in foster care looked better, but there were significant concerns about who got sent to foster care versus who got sent to institutions. It's certainly plausible that more handicapped, more children with more problems would wind up in an institutional setting than in foster care. And so there was no way of knowing if you were really demonstrating a difference in these two methods of care or not without the randomization.
I'll just add one other note. Jamie Robertson produced a film in the UK called A 2-Year-Old Goes to the Hospital. And there he showed the same sort of hospitalism symptoms and changes in behavior that Spitz did. But there they were reinterpreted not within a psychoanalytic frame, but within the Bowlby attachment model. And I think that that's where the field went from a more psychoanalytic approach to understanding the effects of deprivation, caregiver deprivation, to an attachment-centered approach to understanding that. And that has influenced our study in that sense.
Yes, ma'am. Right here.
Yeah.
Right here. No? Okay.
There's a mic coming.
Okay.
Yeah, I think my question is twofold. One, in terms of the training for the foster care providers, were the training standardized, and who supervised that? And did I ask the second question at this time? The second question has to do with the thickening of the cortex and the implications for that.
Okay, so I'll start with the foster care. Foster care had just become legal in Romania in 1997. There were some international adoption agencies that adopted American foster care models in Romanian. So Romanians wrote wrote the foster care manuals that we used. All the foster parents got standardized training. And then we had a team of social workers who met with those foster parents on a regular basis, initially visiting 2 times a week and then weekly. They had regular phone checkups. And if there were problems, they would go and try to be helpful. Those social workers in Romania were supervised by our team in New Orleans on a weekly basis. So we had video conferencing about the children and families that they were seeing to help them sort of problem solve and help them help the foster parents. Yeah, the thicker cortices. So you want to talk about that? Go
ahead.
I'm the youngest.
And the only child. About 10 years ago, Jay Geed and a group through the National Institute of Health published longitudinal data looking at changes in not only the volume of the cortex, but in the thickness of the cortex over development. And what he showed quite dramatically is that starting around age 8 or 10, there's a gradual thinning of the cortex, particularly the prefrontal cortex, which really ends post-adolescence. And the prevailing notion there is that it is due to what's thought of as synaptic pruning or consolidation of circuits in the brain. The precise mechanisms that are associated with it are really not well understood. What we see in these preliminary data is that you get this overall thinning of the cortex in the community controls and in the foster care children, but we're not seeing that in the children who are initially randomized to care as usual. And what that may then suggest is that there's a delay in that process of consolidation or synaptic pruning.
Yes, sir.
Did you measure, did you look at psychosis in any of these kids? Was there any differences, anything?
The question is, did they look at psychosis?
So we had 136 children who had experienced institutional rearing. We've had 1 child who has symptoms that appear to be reflecting schizophrenia. There's been no bipolar disorder whatsoever.
Did you measure psychotic symptoms?
Yes.
Was there a difference in psychotic symptoms?
No. And very few.
So it doesn't look like psychosis is affected by it?
No.
So the comment is that it does not look like psychosis was affected by the deprivation experience because there were not increases in levels of psychosis. Okay, let's have one last question, maybe all the way from the back there. Yep.
So here's with a mic, right here.
Oh.
Here's with a mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
No, this is working.
Last question.
But I have, on a personal note, I have a cousin who adopted a child from one of these orphanages. She's now 20 and has many problems. Oh, I'm sorry, it doesn't work. Yeah, I have a cousin who adopted a young girl, a baby, from one of these orphanages in Romania, and she has a lot of problems. Of course, she's now 20, and she still remembers, she talks about her living in a cage. She said, when I was in that place, that I lived in a cage. I don't know what she's referring to. And then I was thinking about the concept of institutionalization per se. And of course, years ago, a lot of mentally ill people were put in institutions, and now they're in the community. So from your study, I would imagine that the same thing would apply to people who were older and put it into institutions. Is that true or not true?
Interesting question.
So with colleagues in our law school, we've been struggling with this issue. The effects of solitary confinement, for example, on the adolescent or the young adult. So there's two parts to,
Can't hear you.
there's two parts to consider here. One is the effects of profound social deprivation very early in life, which is what we're seeing, versus you've developed a social brain, I put that in quotes, but then during a time when there's strong social needs, such as adolescence, then you're deprived of social contact. We've known for decades the effects of profound deprivation in the adult. I can only imagine that this is exacerbating already underlying issues at the teenager. I'm not so sure about adults. I want to come back to the other thing about your cousin's child, though. We painted I don't want to say a bleak picture, but probably a realistic picture about the sequelae of experiencing profound deprivation early on. But we have to recognize there are individual differences. So not all children, that was the point Charlie was making about competence, not all children will wind up at the same profile. But one thing to consider there is that it's not as though a child is resilient across the board. Some domains are more resistant to adverse effects than others. So one of our children, who's been in an institution since almost birth, has a preserved normal IQ, but her psychopathology is very serious. So we need to keep in mind that the hazards of early adversity like this may play out differently in different kids. At the group level, the hazards are considerable. At the individual level, there may be individual differences. And modeling those and understanding the protective factors is an important way to think about treatment and interventions.